And I'm back with part 2 of my Iplehouse Marien inspired outfit. Today's the vest. So we have a bunch of fabric pieces and a bunch of lining pieces for the vest. And I start with putting the front center to the front side together. Pinning, then sewing, and repeating for both pieces of lining, all 4 pieces of lining and all 4 pieces of fabric. You might have noticed that there's some part of my fabric that hasn't been lined up 100%. That's just how my pattern is. Okay. Repeat and sew. Next, the back center to the back side pieces. And repeat and sew. Next, I'm going to put the 2 back center pieces together for both the fabric and the lining. In this case, I didn't change the thread for the lining because it wasn't going to be very visible anyway. Okay, now I have 4 color pieces, 2 in white, 2 in black. So first I take the black ones, pin the sides, pin the two short sides together, and then the long one. Now I clip the edges so I can turn the pieces inside out properly, and then turn them inside out and pin them in place, so when I press the seams that they lay nice and flat. And I take my fabric and my lining pieces, and I'm going to pin their seams in the directions I want them, and press the seams with my iron. For the back center seam, I'm going to flip the seam both ways and press it, and for the side seams I'm going to flip it towards one of the sides. And then for my front pieces, I flip the seam allowance towards the side and pin in place and paste the seams. Unfortunately, my black fabric isn't as susceptible to be nicely pressed. Anyway, I pin the shoulder seams for the fronts and the backs together with the fabric good side to good side, and sew. Then I fold over the seam allowance and top stitch, and then I sew along the seam allowance of my sleeve holes so that later I can properly sew the lining and fabric together. So now I'm pinning the sides of my fabric and my lining together and sewing. my next step, I'm going to pin my collar pieces to my black fabric and sew them on. First my black fabric, I fold it in half and find the center point. Then I pin the center point of my fabric, of my collar piece, to my clothes, and then start moving out towards the sides. Folding the whole thing in half to checking if everything lines up. And now I'm going to pin my lining fabric to the other piece of fabric, making sure everything lines up properly. And then I sew. My next step, folding the collar back in, and now I'm going to pin my fabric and my lining together, good side to good side, pinning up the collar, the side, front, side and bottom, leaving the sleeve holes open so I can turn the garment inside out. And I'm constantly making sure that my fabric is lined up properly everywhere. And that my lining seams and my fabric seams line up as well. And in some cases I pin my seams to one side to properly put them in place for when I sew. And now I snip the corners so I can turn the whole thing inside out properly. And then I flip it inside out through one of the armholes. So when I turn it inside out, I'm making sure I get all the small corners properly, and I'm going to pin every time around my edges so I can keep the fabric flat for when I press the seams later, so that it's nice and neat. I go all around the edge except for the collar. By the way, if you hear odd noises, I'm sorry, I'm recording a bit late. And after pinning and before pressing the seams, I'm going to use an invisible stitch to sew up the two sleeve or armholes. And I'm using the line I sewed earlier as a guide to properly line up my fabric where it's supposed to be. So one sleeve hole, one armhole done, and onto the next, and then I press my seams with my iron. I'm checking it on my mannequin to make sure everything's going to fit properly. And now I'm going to sew on some I'm going to sew on some snaps for a closure. First sewing onto the black, the top side, and then I'm going to sew it onto the other side. When I'm sewing it to the other side, I specifically sew my snaps at an angle so that I don't catch the black fabric on top, so I won't have visible stitches. The reason I'm doing one side at a time is so that I can properly align my snaps so that they are evenly spaced, because I have a tendency to misplace them and have to re-sew them on sometimes. Now I'm just going to put the decorative stitch on the collar, and off screen I added some silver rhinestones to represent buttons, and we're done. Thanks for watching, and hope you'll stay tuned for the next part. Bye.